The airport was buzzing with people, each traveler lost in their own world, dragging heavy suitcases, rushing toward their gates or saying quick goodbyes. Among the crowd was a tall, well-dressed man, a millionaire businessman who was known for his success and influence. His expensive suit and polished shoes made him stand out from the rest. But at that moment he wasn't thinking about meetings, investments, or luxury. He was only thinking about his young son who stood nervously by his side. The boy was different from most children his age. He was autistic, and though he had a brilliant mind and a pure heart, the world often felt too loud, too bright, and too confusing for him. Crowded places like airports made him anxious. The sound of rolling luggage, the loudspeaker announcements, and the chatter of hundreds of people rushing around was already too much for him to handle. He held tightly onto his father's hand, his eyes darting around as if searching for a safe corner in the chaos. The father, despite all his wealth, felt helpless in that moment. He had promised himself that he would protect his son, that he would make traveling as easy as possible for him. He booked first-class tickets, hoping that more space and comfort would calm his child. He packed his son's favorite toys, noise-canceling, headphones, and snacks that usually helped in stressful situations. He even spoke to the airline staff beforehand, explaining his son's condition so they would be understanding if anything happened. When the boarding call was announced, the father gently guided his son toward the gate. The boy resisted at first, pulling back slightly, his face tightening with worry. Crowds moving in one direction always scared him. The father knelt down, looked into his son's eyes, and whispered softly, "It's okay, buddy, we're just going on an adventure, I'm with you." The boy didn't say much, but he trusted his father. With a deep breath, he walked forward, clutching his small backpack. Inside the plane, the father helped his son find their seats. The boy pressed himself against the window, trying to look outside where the ground staff were busy loading luggage into the belly of the plane. The hum of the aircraft engines was already rumbling in the background, and for the boy it was both fascinating and frightening. His father took out a small toy car from his bag and placed it in his son's hands. The boy smiled faintly, distracted for a moment by the familiar comfort of his toy. As the rest of the passengers boarded, the father noticed people sneaking glances at him and his son. Some seemed curious, others indifferent, and a few even appeared annoyed by the child's restlessness. The father was used to these looks. He had seen them before at restaurants, schools, and public places. People who judged without understanding. People who didn't know what it meant to raise an autistic child. He sighed quietly, but kept his focus on his son, refusing to let the outside world affect their moment. The flight attendants came by with polite smiles, helping passengers store luggage and prepare for takeoff. One of them noticed the boy fidgeting and looked at the father questioningly. He leaned closer and whispered, "He's autistic. Please be patient." The attendant nodded with empathy and continued her work. The boy began to rock back and forth in his seat, a coping mechanism he often used when he felt nervous. The father gently placed an arm around him, whispering soothing words. He knew his son's behaviors by heart. Every small movement, every look in his eyes told a story about how overwhelmed he was feeling. As the plane doors closed and the captain's voice echoed through the speakers announcing their journey, the boy covered his ears tightly. The loud sound startled him and he let out a small cry. His father hugged him closer, trying to distract him with a story about clouds, airplanes, and adventures in the sky. Slowly, the boy calmed down again, resting his head on his father's arm. The millionaire looked out of the window, his thoughts heavy. In his world of luxury, he was used to solving problems with money. If something was broken, he could buy a new one. If something was missing, he could afford to replace it. But with his son, nothing worked like that. Money could not erase his child's struggles. Money could not shield him from stares or silence his cries. Here, in this moment, he was not a powerful businessman. He was just a father, hoping for a peaceful journey. The engines roared louder as the plane began to move down the runway. The boy pressed his face against the window, his small hands gripping the armrest tightly. The world outside blurred as the plane lifted off the ground. For most passengers, it was just the start of another flight. But for this father and son, it was the start of a challenge. The father prayed silently that his son would stay calm, that the flight would pass without trouble. He had no idea that ahead of him, something unexpected was about to happen, something that would not only change the way he saw his son, but also remind everyone on that plane about the true meaning of kindness. The plane had only been in the air for a short while when the boy's discomfort began to show more clearly. At first it was subtle. He shifted in his seat, tapped his fingers on the armrest, and mumbled softly to himself. His father noticed immediately. He had learned long ago that these small signs were warnings, signals that his son was becoming overwhelmed. He tried distracting him again, offering the toy car, a snack, even pointing out the white clouds drifting by outside the window. For a few minutes, it seemed to help. But then, the sudden sound of the overhead announcement startled the boy so much that he flinched and clutched his ears tightly. His whole body stiffened, and before the father could soothe him, the first loud scream tore through the cabin. The father's heart sank. He knew this was coming, but he had hoped, just this once, that they might make it through a flight without. The boy's cries grew louder, echoing in the confined space of the plane. He kicked his legs against the seat, squirming as if trapped. The pressure in the cabin, the constant noise, the closeness of strangers, everything felt like too much for him. His screams weren't the cries of a spoiled child. They were cries of pain, of sensory overload that he couldn't explain in. Board's passengers began turning their heads. Some frowned, annoyed at the disruption. A few whispered to one another, their voices sharp with judgment. "Why can't he control his kid?" someone muttered. Another sighed loudly, shaking their head as if the father was failing at the most basic task of parenting. The father heard every word. His chest tightened with frustration and shame, though he knew he shouldn't feel ashamed. His son was not misbehaving, he was struggling. Still, the weight of all those eyes on them was crushing. He leaned down, cupping his son's face gently, whispering, "It's okay. It's okay. Daddy's here. You're safe. Breathe with me." He rocked him slowly, trying to create a sense of rhythm that might calm him. But the boy shoved him away, thrashing, unable to regulate his emotions. The father pulled out the noise-canceling headphones and placed them over his ears, but the boy ripped them off and tossed them to the floor. His cries only grew louder, high-pitched and piercing. The flight attendant rushed over, concern on her face. She crouched beside the father and asked softly, "Is there anything we can do to help?" The father shook his head, trying to manage a polite smile. "Thank you, but he just needs time. He's autistic. He'll calm down eventually." The attendant nodded, understanding, but the passengers behind her were less patient. A man leaned forward in his seat, muttering angrily, "Some of us paid good money for this flight. Can't you control your kid?" His wife nudged him to stop, but his words were already hanging in the air like poison. The father's face flushed red. He wanted to shout back, to tell them they had no idea how hard every day could be, how much love and effort it took just to help his son navigate the world. But he stayed quiet, focusing on his child. Anger wouldn't help. The boy's screams echoed again, sharp and painful. A baby in the back row started crying, triggered by the noise. Other children covered their ears. Some passengers groaned, while others simply watched with a mixture of pity and discomfort. The father felt trapped in the narrow seat, trapped by judgmental stares, trapped by the heartbreaking reality that he could not make this easier for his son. Minutes felt like hours. He tried everything he could think of, hugging, rocking, offering water, singing softly into his ear. Nothing worked. His son's world was too loud, too overwhelming, and no amount of love seemed strong enough to cut through it. The father could feel the tears burning in his own eyes, but he forced them back. He was a millionaire, a man who had stood in boardrooms and commanded respect, a man who could buy anything he wanted. Yet here, on this plane, with his child crying uncontrollably in his arms, he felt utterly powerless. The boy began hitting the seat in front of him with his fists, his little body shaking with frustration. The passenger sitting there turned around sharply, irritation clear on his face. "Can you do something?" he demanded. The father opened his mouth to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? that he was trying, that he wished with all his heart his son could be calm, could be like other children just for a little while. He wanted to explain, but he was too tired, too drained to fight for understanding yet again. The flight attendant returned, offering the boy a small toy airplane from the service cart, hoping it might distract him. For a brief moment, the boy grabbed it, staring at it in his hands. Silence fell in the cabin, a collective sigh of relief sweeping over the passengers. But just as quickly, the boy dropped the toy and screamed again, even louder than before. The father buried his face in his hands. He could feel the weight of disappointment crushing him. Not disappointment in his son, never in his son, but in himself, in his inability to shield him from this pain, in his inability to shield him from the cruelty of strangers' stares. He kissed the top of his son's head, whispering over and over, "I love you, I love you, I love you," hoping that somehow those words could reach through the storm raging inside the boy. What the father didn't know was that among the rows of passengers, a pair of curious eyes had been watching carefully. A young boy, poor and humble, sat quietly beside his mother. Unlike the others, his gaze wasn't filled with judgment or irritation. It was filled with empathy. He didn't see a spoiled child or an incapable father. He saw a little boy in pain. He saw a chance to help, and soon he would surprise everyone. The father sat there with his son in his arms, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his face heavy with exhaustion. The screaming hadn't stopped, and though he tried to appear strong on the outside, inside he was breaking. Every scream felt like a knife cutting into his chest, not because of the noise, but because he knew his boy was suffering, and he couldn't take that pain away. He had spent years learning about autism, attending therapy sessions, hiring the best specialists money could buy. He had read every book, spoken to every expert, and invested in every tool that promised to help his son feel more comfortable in the world. And still, here they were, stuck 30,000 feet in the air, surrounded by strangers who would never understand, facing a storm that no amount of money could calm. He glanced at his son's face, red with frustration, tears streaking down his cheeks. His small hands clenched and unclenched as if trying to fight the invisible chaos around him. The father gently brushed the boy's hair back, whispering, "It's okay, son, I'm here, Daddy's here." His voice cracked on the last word. Around them, the cabin was thick with tension. Some passengers turned away, unwilling to watch. Others kept glaring as though their stares could force the boy into silence. A few even exchanged comments, not loud enough for everyone to hear, but sharp enough to pierce the father's heart. "Why don't they just sedate him?" one man muttered to his wife. "Rich people and yet can't control their own kids," another whispered. The father pretended not to hear, but his ears caught every syllable. He had built his entire life on reputation, respect, and the admiration of others. But in moments like this, all that collapsed. His millions, his business empire, his name, none of it mattered. All that mattered was this child, this boy who was both his greatest joy and his greatest test. The boy screamed again, thrashing in his seat, and the father instinctively wrapped both arms around him, pulling him close. The boy resisted, wriggling, as though trying to escape his father's embrace, but the father held firm, not out of force but out of desperate love. He rocked him gently, his lips moving in a soft hum, a tune he used to sing when the boy was much younger, when sleepless. Nights seemed endless. It didn't stop the screaming, but for a moment the boy leaned against him, his cries muffled against his father's chest. The father closed his eyes, remembering the early years, how doctors had given him the diagnosis, how his world had shifted in an instant. He remembered the denial, the anger, the long nights of guilt where he questioned if he had done something wrong. But more than that, he remembered the first time his son had smiled at him, the first time he had held his tiny hand, the first time he had laughed at something silly. Those memories gave him strength now. He wished the people around him could see his son the way he did, not as a disruption, not as a burden, but as a beautiful, innocent soul who simply experienced the world differently. But strangers rarely saw that. They saw only the noise, the behavior, the inconvenience. The father bent down, his lips near his son's ear, whispering, "I know it's hard, buddy. I know the sounds are loud and the lights are bright and it feels like too much. But you're safe. Daddy is here. I'll never leave you." His voice trembled, and he felt tears sting his eyes. He quickly wiped them away before they could fall. He couldn't let his son see his weakness. He had to be strong, even when every bone in his body ached with exhaustion. A flight attendant returned with a small blanket, offering it kindly. The father accepted it with a nod of gratitude, wrapping it gently around his son, hoping the pressure might calm him. The boy resisted at first, pushing it away, but eventually he let it stay, clutching it tightly in his little fists. The father exhaled slowly, relief washing over him for just a moment, but the calm didn't last. Another announcement crackled over the speakers, and once again the boy shrieked, clawing at his ears. His screams echoed so loudly that even the attendants in the galley flinched. The father felt his shoulders slump. He had prepared for this trip in every way he knew how. Snacks, toys, headphones, blankets, even conversations with the staff beforehand. But no plan could prepare him for the reality of his son's struggle. He wished he could take his son's place to carry the burden himself. But all he could do was hold him and whisper promises he wasn't sure his son could even understand. Minutes dragged on like hours. Sweat beaded on the father's forehead. His voice grew hoarse from constant soothing. His arms ached from holding his son, but he didn't dare let go. He felt completely alone, an island of chaos in a sea of judgment. And then came the worst moment. A man from a nearby row finally snapped. He stood up halfway, leaning over the seat, and barked, "Can you shut that kid up? This is unbearable." His words cut like a blade through the cabin. Several passengers gasped. Some agreed silently with their eyes. The father froze. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His chest burned with humiliation. He wanted to shout back, to defend his son, to scream that this wasn't bad parenting or misbehavior. It was autism. But the words died in his throat. He bowed his head instead, kissing his son's hair, whispering, "Don't listen, buddy. Don't listen. You're perfect, just the way you are." His voice shook, and a single tear slipped down his cheek. For the first time in years, he felt completely powerless. This was the father's struggle. It wasn't just calming a meltdown. It was holding the weight of the world's judgment, battling his own exhaustion, and loving his son fiercely in a world that often couldn't understand him. And yet, in that moment of darkness, something unexpected was about to shine through, a light from the most unlikely source. The cabin had become a strange theater of emotions. The cries of the autistic boy filled every corner of the plane, weaving themselves into the hum of the engines and the rattle of the overhead bins. It was inescapable. Some passengers leaned back in their seats, closing their eyes, trying to pretend they couldn't hear. Others were less forgiving, shifting in their chairs, folding their arms, or sighing with exaggerated impatience. The father felt the pressure of 100 invisible eyes pressing down on him. He was used to being noticed in boardrooms and interviews at grand events, but this attention was different. This wasn't admiration or respect. This was judgment. Silent, sharp judgment that pierced him deeper than any financial loss ever could. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband and whispered, but her voice carried just enough for the father to hear. "This is why I hate flying with kids. Parents should know better." Her husband grunted in agreement, adjusting his newspaper as if that statement had settled the matter. 2 rows behind, a young man yanked his headphones from his ears in frustration. "Unbelievable," he muttered, his voice low but laced with venom. "I paid almost $1,000 for this flight, and this is what I get?" His complaint wasn't aimed directly at the father, but it stabbed all the same. The father swallowed, hard, pulling his son closer. He wanted to stand up and shout, "Do you think I don't know how loud it is? Do you think I'm not trying? Do you think I don't wish every single day that my son could find peace in moments like this?" But he stayed quiet. Confrontation would only make things worse. Not every passenger was cruel. A few glanced over with soft, pitying eyes, as if silently telling the father they understood. A mother traveling with her toddler gave him a sympathetic nod, whispering something to calm her own child who was now startled awake by the noise. An elderly woman clutched her rosary beads, mouthing a silent prayer, not in annoyance, but in hope that the boy might find peace. These small gestures of compassion were like drops of water in a desert, but they were not enough to ease the father's pain. The flight attendants tried to manage the situation as best they could. One came forward with another blanket, another with a cup of juice, offering it with a gentle smile. They spoke in low tones, trying not to draw more attention, but the passengers weren't blind. They saw the boy's resistance, the way he pushed away every attempt at comfort. The murmurs began to spread like ripples in water. "Can't the airline do something?" someone whispered. "Maybe they should land early," another added. "This is unfair to everyone else," came a voice from the back. Each complaint, though not shouted, carried the same weight as a direct accusation. The father's heart clenched with each one. His son wasn't a criminal. He wasn't misbehaving out of choice. He was overwhelmed, drowning in sensations he couldn't explain. But to strangers it all looked the same. Chaos. The boy's cries rose higher, his small fists pounding against the seat in front of him. The passenger sitting there had been patient at first, but now his patience cracked. He turned around abruptly, his eyes sharp with anger. "Sir, you need to control your child," he snapped. His voice was louder than the whispers, loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. The father opened his mouth, searching for words, but what could he say? That he was trying. That this wasn't something that could be controlled. That autism didn't come with a switch he could flip on and off. But the words tangled in his throat. He simply nodded weakly, whispering, "I'm sorry." Though he hated himself for saying it. Why should he apologize for his son's condition? Yet the pressure of so many eyes left him no choice. The angry passenger turned back with a huff, muttering, "Ridiculous," under his breath. The father looked down at his son, who was now sobbing into his chest, his little body trembling with exhaustion. He stroked his hair, whispering words of comfort that sounded empty even to his own ears. "You're okay. Daddy's here. You're okay." Time stretched painfully. Every second felt like a battle. The father's throat burned from whispering. His arms ached from holding his son, and still the noise did not stop. He felt the weight of despair pressing down on him, heavier than any burden he had ever carried in his life. For a moment, his thoughts darkened. What if we shouldn't have taken this flight? What if I was selfish to bring him here? What if everyone on this plane hates us now? The questions swirled like smoke in his mind, suffocating him. He closed his eyes tightly, fighting against the shame that threatened to consume him. Meanwhile, the passengers continued to react in their own ways. A businessman in a crisp suit shook his head and returned to his laptop, though his typing was now furious, his frustration spilling onto the keyboard. A group of teenagers snickered quietly, pulling out their phones to record snippets of the chaos, though a sharp look from a flight attendant quickly put an end to it. A young couple in the corner exchanged helpless glances, the woman resting, her head on her partner's shoulder, whispering, "Poor kid," though her tone was more tired than empathetic. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. The cries had become more than just background noise. They were the center of everyone's attention, the thing no one could ignore. The cabin was no longer just a space for travel. It had become a stage for judgment, a place where strangers revealed who they truly were when tested by discomfort. Some showed compassion, most did not. And through it all, the father sat there, his arms wrapped around his son, his body a shield against the storm of judgment. He whispered again and again, "I've got you, buddy, I won't let go." His voice was breaking, but his resolve was not. Yet as the tension in the cabin reached its peak, something unexpected stirred. Not from the wealthy passengers who sat in polished shoes and tailored jackets. Not from the tired travelers who sighed and complained. But from a small figure sitting quietly just a few rows away. A poor black boy whose eyes had been watching, not with judgment, but with a kind of understanding that no adult on that plane seemed capable of. He saw what others didn't. He saw not a spoiled child, but a boy in pain. Not a helpless father, but a man carrying the weight of love heavier than gold. And in his young heart, an idea began to bloom. While others reacted with frustration, pity, or anger, this boy would soon act with something much more powerful: kindness. A kindness so unexpected that it would silence the whispers, soften the glares, and leave every single person on that flight questioning the true meaning of wealth. The storm inside the airplane cabin seemed endless. The boy's cries still echoed, his small body still trembling against his father's chest. The man's whispers were soft and desperate, but they were swallowed by the sound of distress. Around them, the passengers had reached their limits. Some resigned, some angry, others merely exhausted from the chaos. And yet, in the middle of all that noise, there was one pair of eyes that didn't look away, one soul who wasn't annoyed but moved. It was a boy, much younger than most of the travelers, perhaps 10 or 11 years old. His clothes were simple, worn at the edges, his sneakers scuffed from years of being passed down. He sat close to the window beside his mother, a hard-working woman who had managed to buy the cheapest tickets at the very back of the plane. They didn't fly often. In fact, this was his very first time on an airplane. For him, everything about this journey was new. The rows of seats, the tiny windows, the tray tables that folded down like magic. He had been excited, curious, and wide-eyed at every detail. But now his attention was fixed entirely on the crying boy near the front of the cabin. Unlike the others, he didn't see a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. He didn't see a rich father failing to control his son. What he saw was pain, raw, overwhelming pain. And even though he didn't know the word autism, he understood, in the way only children sometimes do, that the boy wasn't being bad. He was hurting. The poor boy glanced at his mother. She was tired, her head resting against the seat, eyes closed for a moment of peace. He didn't want to disturb her, so he turned his attention back to the scene unfolding in front of him. His small hands fidgeted with a toy he carried, a simple handmade puzzle his mother had given him to pass the time. It wasn't expensive or flashy like the gadgets he saw other kids holding, but it was his favorite. It always calmed him when he felt restless. He watched the millionaire father struggle, watched the way the man's arms trembled as he held his son, the way his eyes glistened with unshed tears. The poor boy's chest tightened. He knew what it was like to see adults cry. His own mother had cried at night when she thought he was asleep, whispering prayers for strength, for money to buy food, for life to somehow be kinder. He knew the sound of helplessness. And that was the same sound he saw written across the father's face now. Something stirred inside him, a mixture of empathy and courage. He didn't know exactly why, but he felt he had to do something. First, he hesitated. He was just a kid. The father was a grown man dressed in a suit worth more than his family probably earned in a year. What could he, a poor boy from a forgotten neighborhood, possibly do that this powerful man could not? He shifted in his seat, unsure. But then the autistic boy screamed again, and this time the poor boy's heart broke a little. He couldn't sit still anymore. He leaned forward slightly, peeking down the aisle, watching as the father rocked his son, desperately whispering words that seemed to dissolve into the noise. The passengers around them were stiff and silent, their expressions hard. No one else was going to help. He bit his lip, then turned to his mother and tugged gently at her sleeve. She opened her eyes slowly, giving him a tired but loving smile. "What is it, sweetheart?" she whispered. "Mom." He hesitated, then glanced toward the front. "That boy, he's really upset. Can I go? Can I try to help him?" His mother followed his gaze. She had been trying to block out the noise, but now she saw what her son had seen all along. The father's struggle, the boy's anguish, the heavy silence of judgment hanging in the cabin. Her heart ached. She placed her hand on her son's cheek, studying his determined eyes. He was just a child, but there was a wisdom in him she couldn't deny. "You think you can help?" she asked softly. The boy nodded. "I want to try." She hesitated for a moment. They didn't know the rich man or his son. They were strangers, worlds apart in status and life. But then again, kindness didn't know boundaries. She sighed gently, smoothing her son's hair back. "All right," she whispered. "Go on then. Be careful and be kind." The boy's heart raced as he unbuckled his seatbelt. A few nearby, passengers looked at him curiously, wondering why this small figure was standing up when the air still buzzed with tension. He clutched his little puzzle tightly in his hands and stepped slowly down the narrow aisle, his sneakers squeaking faintly. Against the floor, each step felt heavier than it should. He could feel the eyes of strangers following him, questioning, doubting. Some frowned as if silently asking, "What is that child doing?" But he ignored them. His focus was on the boy near the front, still crying, still trembling in his father's arms. The millionaire father noticed him first. At first he didn't understand. He saw only a small figure walking toward him, a boy he didn't recognize. Confused, he blinked, his mind too weary to process what was happening. The poor boy stopped just a few feet away, his hands clutching his toy nervously. He looked at the father, then at the crying child, then back again. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, but clear enough to cut through the noise. "Excuse me, sir," he said. Can I try?" The father's brows furrowed. "Try?" he repeated, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The boy held up his puzzle, his small fingers trembling slightly. "Sometimes when I feel upset, this helps me. Maybe it will help him too." For a moment, the father just stared. His mind was clouded with fatigue, with embarrassment, with hopelessness. And here was this child, this poor boy with nothing fancy in his hands, offering something so simple yet so genuine. The passengers who had been watching now leaned closer, curious. Whispers rippled through the cabin. What was this boy doing? Why was he stepping in when no adult had dared to? The father hesitated, torn between confusion and desperation, but then he looked at his son, his beautiful, struggling boy whose cries had not softened for what felt like an eternity. And he looked back at the child in front of him, whose eyes shone with sincerity. Finally, with a weary nod, he whispered, "All right. Go ahead." The poor boy stepped closer, his hands steady now as he knelt down beside the autistic child. He didn't rush, didn't push, didn't speak loudly. He simply held out the puzzle, offering it like a gift, his voice gentle. "Hey, do you want to see this? It's really fun." The cabin, once filled with murmurs and complaints, now fell into a different kind of silence, an expectant, almost reverent hush. Dozens of eyes watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The cabin had fallen into a strange, heavy silence, the kind of silence that wasn't truly quiet, but was filled with unspoken questions. Every passenger was waiting, eyes fixed on the poor boy who had dared to step forward. Some were skeptical, some were annoyed, and some were curious. No one could predict what might happen next. The father sat frozen, his exhausted arms still wrapped around his autistic son. He looked at the small boy kneeling before them and felt a rush of confusion mixed with a flicker of hope he hardly dared to believe in. Could this stranger, a child himself, really do anything that all his money, all his efforts, all his desperate whispers could not? The poor boy didn't seem to notice the stares. His whole world in that moment was focused on the child in front of him. He didn't see the millionaire's suit, the expensive watch glinting under the cabin lights, or the judgmental eyes of wealthy travelers. All he saw was another boy, red-faced and trembling, lost in a storm of emotions he couldn't escape. Slowly, the poor boy stretched out his hands, holding the puzzle gently as though it were something precious. His voice was soft, almost like a melody. "Hey, I made this with my mom," he whispered. "It's not fancy, but it helps me when I feel upset. Do you want to try it?" The autistic boy's cries were still sharp, his little fists still pounding against the seat. But something in that soft tone made him pause for the briefest moment. His teary eyes flickered toward the object being offered. It wasn't bright or flashy like the toys his father had packed. It was simple, wooden, and slightly worn, with edges smoothed by countless hours of use. The father noticed that pause, that tiny shift in his son's focus, and his heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could something so small work when nothing else had? He loosened his hold slightly, giving his son space but staying close, ready to catch him if another wave of distress came. The poor boy didn't push. He didn't force the puzzle into the child's hands. Instead, he placed it gently on the foldable tray table within reach and pulled back just a little. His hands rested in his lap, his eyes kind and patient. The autistic boy blinked, his cries faltering into soft whimpers. He stared at the puzzle, his breathing uneven. His small fingers twitched, reaching out slowly, hesitantly, as though testing the idea of trust. Finally, he touched it. Just the edge at first, then he pulled it closer. The moment his hands closed around the puzzle, the cabin seemed to exhale. The cries softened further, replaced by sniffles and small, concentrated breaths. The boy turned the puzzle over, studying its pieces with a curious focus. His father's eyes widened in disbelief. This was the first time in the entire flight that his son had stopped screaming. The poor boy smiled gently. "That piece fits here," he said softly, pointing but not touching. "See? Just twist it a little." His tone wasn't commanding. It was calm, inviting, like one child sharing a secret with another. The autistic boy fumbled for a moment, then pushed the piece into place. It clicked softly. His lips parted, and a faint sound escaped. Not a cry, but something closer to a giggle. His father's heart broke and healed all at once at that tiny sound. The passengers, who had been stiff and restless, leaned in, astonished. They had been bracing themselves for hours of screaming, for frustration that no adult could solve. Yet here, before their very eyes, a poor child with nothing but patience and a handmade toy had done the impossible. The father's throat tightened. He whispered almost to himself, How did you do that?" His voice shook with disbelief. The poor boy looked up, his eyes wide with innocence. "I just listened," he said simply. "Sometimes when people are sad, they don't need you to tell them what to do. They just need you to sit with them and share something." The father blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. Those words, so simple, so pure, cut deeper than any lecture from experts, deeper than all the advice he had paid for. From the mouth of a poor boy came the wisdom he had been searching for all along. The autistic boy was now fully engaged, his little fingers twisting and turning the puzzle, his cries forgotten. Every time a piece fit, he let out a small hum of satisfaction. The poor boy encouraged him with soft claps and quiet laughter, as though they had been friends forever. The father watched in awe. He had never seen his son respond like this to a stranger, especially not in such a chaotic environment. His son, who usually shut down around new people, was now sitting calmly, focused, his shoulders relaxed. It felt like a miracle. Tears slid down the father's cheeks silently. He didn't wipe them away. For once, he didn't care if anyone saw. He looked at the poor boy, at his scuffed sneakers and patched-up clothes, and felt a wave of humility wash over him. Here he was, a man of great wealth and influence, being taught by a child who had nothing material to give, but everything human to share. The cabin itself seemed transformed. The passengers who had once been irritated now sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide. Some smiled softly, others looked ashamed for their earlier complaints. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, whispering to her husband, "Did you see that?" A man who had barked at the father earlier now stared at the floor, guilt heavy in his expression. The flight attendants, too, stood at the aisle, watching the scene unfold with tears in their eyes. One whispered to another, "I've never seen anything like this." The autistic boy, still holding the puzzle, leaned toward the poor boy with a faint smile, his first of the entire flight. It wasn't big, but it was enough. Enough to show connection. Enough to show trust. The poor boy grinned back. "You're really good at this," he said. his voice glowing with encouragement. Better than me. The father placed a trembling hand on the poor boy's shoulder. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Thank you. Thank you so much." The poor boy shrugged, his eyes bright with innocence. "You don't have to thank me, sir. He just needed a friend." Those words landed heavier than gold in the father's heart. He couldn't speak. He simply nodded, swallowing hard, his chest swelling with gratitude and humility. The rest of the cabin sat in reverent silence, watching not just a moment of peace, but a lesson unfold before their eyes, a lesson that kindness costs nothing, yet can accomplish what wealth and power cannot. And as the puzzle clicked softly in the hands of the autistic child, the entire plane seemed lighter, quieter, touched by a grace that no one had expected to witness 30,000 feet in the air. For the first time since the flight had begun, the cabin breathed. The sharp cries that had once pierced the air had melted into quiet hums of concentration. The autistic boy was now absorbed in the puzzle, twisting and turning each piece with growing confidence. Every click of wood sliding into place was like a small victory, a sound of peace in a space that had been filled with chaos. But it wasn't just the boy who was changing. It was the cabin itself. The same passengers who had shifted restlessly in their seats, muttering complaints and sighs of frustration, now sat still, watching. Their expressions, once hardened with irritation, softened as their eyes followed the little boy in worn sneakers, kneeling beside the millionaire's son. The sight carried a quiet kind of magic. The transformation was so subtle at first that no one realized it. A businessman who had angrily demanded silence earlier now sat with his arms crossed, but his shoulders no longer carried hostility. They slumped in quiet shame. A woman who had rolled her eyes every time the autistic boy screamed now had tears brimming, her lips pressed tightly together as though trying to contain her emotion. A teenager with headphones pulled them down around his neck, leaning forward with a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't just silence filling the cabin. It was awe. For hours they had believed the problem was unfixable. They had looked to the father, to the flight attendants, even to each other, waiting for someone to solve the noise that had disrupted their comfort. Yet the solution had not come from authority, or wealth, or age. It had come from the least expected place, from a child who had almost nothing, offering the only thing he had: kindness. The millionaire father felt it most of all. His arms, which had been locked around his son in a desperate embrace, were finally free. He sat back, watching his boy interact with the puzzle, his chest rising and falling in steady relief. Every so often, he glanced at the poor boy, still kneeling, still smiling patiently, and his throat tightened with gratitude that words could not capture. When he looked up again, he caught the eyes of the passengers nearest him. Some quickly looked away, embarrassed. Others gave small nods as though silently admitting that they had judged him too quickly. The father didn't hold their stares long. He wasn't interested in their judgment anymore. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in his son's struggles. The autistic boy turned another piece, clicking it into place. His lips curved into a smile, small, fragile, but unmistakable. The poor boy clapped softly, leaning closer. "You did it again," he whispered. "You're so smart." The smile widened. It wasn't laughter yet, but it was the purest kind of joy, the kind that didn't need words. And in that moment, the father felt something stir deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The flight attendants, standing discreetly by the galley, exchanged glances. One of them whispered, "I've been flying for 10 years and I've never seen anything like this." Another nodded, dabbing her eyes with a napkin she pretended was for her nose. They had seen countless conflicts on flights, but rarely did they witness a scene that reminded them of humanity's best side. Gradually, the passengers began to shift, not out of discomfort, but out of a strange pull toward the moment unfolding before them. A mother leaned down to whisper something to her daughter, who nodded solemnly. An elderly man adjusted his glasses, blinking away moisture he pretended wasn't there. It was as though the boy's act of kindness had cracked something open inside them all. They remembered suddenly what it felt like to be vulnerable. They remembered what it was like to cry in public, to need help, to be met with indifference or kindness. They remembered their own children, their own fears, their own silent prayers whispered on nights no one else could hear. The millionaire father, still overwhelmed, leaned forward to the poor boy. His voice was low, trembling. "What's your name?" The poor boy glanced up shyly. "David," he answered softly. "David," the father repeated, almost reverently. He let the name linger on his tongue, as though it carried a weight far greater than just syllables. Then he placed a hand on David's shoulder, squeezing gently. "You've done more for my son in 10 minutes than anyone has in years." David shrugged, his face flushing. "I just wanted to help." The father's chest tightened. He wanted to say more, to offer money, gifts, opportunities. But something told him that wasn't what David needed. No, this child didn't act out of want. He acted out of something far richer, something no amount of money could buy. The autistic boy giggled suddenly, a small but clear sound as he snapped another puzzle piece into place. The sound rippled through the cabin like sunlight breaking through clouds. David laughed softly with him, their shared joy lighting up the space more than the cabin lights ever could. And in that laughter, something extraordinary happened. The tension that had gripped the entire cabin dissolved. The businessman, who had sat with arms crossed, let out a shaky chuckle, shaking his head at himself. The woman with tears in her eyes clapped once softly, as though cheering quietly from the sidelines. A teenager whispered, "That's amazing." His voice filled with genuine admiration. It was as if the act of kindness had created a chain reaction. People who had been strangers a moment ago were now united in witnessing a miracle. Not the miracle of silence, but the miracle of compassion. The atmosphere shifted so completely that even the hum of the engines seemed gentler. The cabin, once heavy with frustration, now vibrated with something unspoken but deeply felt. The millionaire father leaned back in his seat, his eyes never leaving his son, who was now calm, focused, and, most importantly, happy. Tears blurred his vision again, but this time they weren't from despair. They were from gratitude, from relief, from the realization that love could come from the most unexpected places. And the passengers, every one of them, felt changed. For some, it was a lesson in patience. For others, it was a reminder of humility. And for many, it was proof that kindness still existed in the world, that sometimes it came not from wealth, not from power, but from a child with nothing to give but his heart. No one spoke loudly. No one dared to break the spell. But in that quiet, shared space, every person knew they had witnessed something sacred. David, still kneeling by the tray table, looked at the autistic boy and grinned. "You're my friend now," he said simply. The boy in his own way seemed to understand. He hugged the puzzle close to his chest, a content hum vibrating softly from his lips. And the cabin, 30,000 feet above the ground, became more than just a place of travel. It became a sanctuary, a place where class, color, and circumstance dissolved, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of human connection. It was a transformation no one would forget.